Brexit, how is it going to affect the subcontinent in the long run? Is Britain going to pull out completely after the 2 years that have been stipulated for a complete pullout? What is going to happen to the world's economy? How is Sri Lankan exports going to affect the European Union in the next few years? How important is it for Sri Lanka to capitalize on the Asian markets and to drive exports? Where is Sri Lankan economy moving forward? To discuss all this and more with emphasis on Brexit, joining me this evening is Dr. Joseph Mariatasan, who is a financial market expert. A very good evening to you, Dr. Joseph, and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Starting off, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background and the areas of expertise.
Sure. I'm a partner of a corporate finance firm, Pangea Finance Partners, that's focused on China and the developed markets. And we help capital flows between China and essentially Europe and the US. And myself and my partners spend a lot of time in China, and we spend a lot of time in Europe, and we spend a lot of time in the US looking at transactions and looking at structures and so on. But I'm also a contributing editor to the leading European institutional investment and pensions magazine called Investments and Pensions Europe. And in that capacity, I speak to lots of fund managers, to lots of pension funds, to lots of experts in the financial markets across a whole range of subjects that affects the global financial markets and pensions.
Dr. Joseph, you said that you speak to fund managers, financial market experts about the forward march, the forward thinking of the world's economy per se. How do you view the global economy at present?
Well, it's still recovering from the after effects of the 2007-2008 global financial crisis. The world is experiencing an experiment, a massive experiment in the form of quantitative easing, where you had the major central banks in the US, the UK, in Europe and in Japan, essentially printing money and introducing huge amounts of liquidity into the market, to such an extent that we have the rather bizarre situation that 40% of the government bonds in Europe are yielding negative rates. So
it's been 8 years now following the global financial crisis in 2007 and 2008. This is the year 2016. Why isn't it that the world powerful bodies, the IMF, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, why haven't they been able to arrest the problem at hand?
Well, because no one actually knows how to, basically. You could argue, and there are lots of different explanations, you could argue that the West may be living beyond its means to a great extent, that to maintain living standards in the West, they have had to effectively live off debt. You know, the high growth countries are countries like Sri Lanka, countries like China, countries like India, with younger populations with higher growth rates. To maintain living standards in the West, in Europe and the US, they've had to effectively go for deficit funding. They've had to actually fund their living standards by debt, large amounts of debt.
Doctor, you said that the West is living beyond its means. How reliant is the West on the Chinese market, and how reliant are the Chinese on the Western market?
Well, China has actually become much more important over the last 15 years or so. The China really only opened up probably around about 2000. It's becoming increasingly important. Clearly, if you look at, I think something like 60% of all the M&A activity globally last year was financed by China. China is now moving away from just being an export-oriented economy to domestic consumption. And that means it's absorbing huge amounts of exports of luxury goods from Europe. If you look at cars, if you look at clothing, if you look at fashion and so on, China is probably the biggest market for any consumer, for any manufacturer rather.
Dr. Joseph, taking into account what happened in Britain a couple of weeks ago, Brexit, how is this affecting the world economy?
Well, the answer to that is people are still trying to figure that out. The issue is so complex and so new. No one has really come to grips with what does it actually mean. And what does Brexit itself mean? The new British Prime Minister Theresa May is saying Brexit means Brexit, but that doesn't really answer the question. Is Britain going to leave the common market completely? Or not? Well, clearly there's a dilemma between having access to the European common market and having a free flow of labour. What Britain wants to have is complete access to the common market, but wants to actually put barriers to the free flow of labour from the European Union to Britain.
Dr. Joseph, just days after the Brexit vote, after David Cameron announced his resignation as the Prime Minister, the European Parliament met. The European Parliament had very clearly articulated that Britain cannot pick the cherries from the cake. Either they're in or they're out. So they have chosen to go out. So how crucial is it going to be the next 2 years for Britain?
It's not just the next 2 years. What actually happens is that nothing has changed. The referendum was wasn't a legal decision to leave. It was just a statement or an expression of views by the population. Now, to actually set in motion the process of leaving, the government has to invoke Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty of the EU, which says we wish to leave and we will have 2 years to negotiate. Now, the government is in no hurry to do that, so they may actually delay even invoking that till next year.
And why is that, Dr.
Because there's no advantage in invoking it sooner. In fact, the later they invoke it, the better, because they haven't figured out what to do. The pro-Brexit politicians, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, and so on, had no plan. They didn't expect to win.
And you expected, you just saw an individual, Mr. Nigel Farage, even leaving politics after the Brexit vote.
Well, yes, quite. Well, Nigel Farage is on the fringes of politics, but he was one of the reasons why David Cameron actually invoked the idea of a referendum. There was no pressure within Britain to have a referendum, but the Conservative Party at the last election was facing challenges from the UK Independence Party led by Nigel Farage, and to actually help their own political position, they said, or Cameron said, we're going to have a referendum on the EU. And in that way, he actually won a Conservative majority. Now, that wasn't in the interest of the country as a whole. It was in the interest of the Conservative Party, a very narrow segment of the Conservative Party. As a result, Cameron may well end up being the Prime Minister who not only forced Britain or led to Britain leaving the EU, but potentially the breakup of the United Kingdom itself.
Do the British people know the implications of Brexit?
When I say the British people, the vote was highly polarised. 75% of the 18 to 35-year-old age group voted to remain in the EU because they feared what would happen, which is almost what we're seeing now. The people who tended to vote to stay tended to be the older generation, the less educated generation, the white generation, the Little Englanders, you can call it, for whom they harken back to the pre-EU days, where they didn't see their local shops being taken over by Polish shops, or their workforce being undercut by Hungarians and Romanians and Poles.
So you mean to say, Dr. Joseph, that the vote was polarized, people did not know what they were up for?
Absolutely.
And the future?
Absolutely, yes.
Who did you favour? Which
I voted to remain. I'll tell you why. Because the arguments, no one knows whether Britain will be better off under Brexit or not. It may be better off, it may not be. But what you can be absolutely certain of, that by voting for Brexit, there will be a period of years of uncertainty and chaos. And what we're seeing now is just the beginning of that. And already sterling has fallen 15-20%. The political parties are in disarray. The Conservative Party is in complete disarray. The Labour Party looks as though it may split apart. Britain as a stable political entity is now facing enormous challenges which may tear it apart over the next 5 years.
Is there a possibility, Dr. Joseph, that Britain may choose to stay in the European Union and not sign the Lisbon Treaty?
Well, no, to sign the Lisbon Treaty, you're right. There is a possibility that some fudge may be created. That Theresa May has said Brexit means Brexit, but no one has actually said what it actually means.
What does it actually mean?
Well, it can mean a lot of different things, and that's the key to the solution. Brexit can mean a lot of different things. At one stage, it could mean a complete withdrawal from Europe in terms of access to the common market, access to or the free movement of labour. It could mean rescinding all European legislation that impacts the UK. And it could mean the UK then promoting far closer ties, as Farage and Johnson and so on, with not only with the US, but with China, with India, with the old Commonwealth. And so there's a lot to be said for that. On the other hand, it could also mean just a tweaking at the edges of the current situation. It could mean that there is less of a freedom of movement of labour, but Britain still has access to most of the benefits of the common market.
Joseph, let's talk about the subcontinent. Countries like Sri Lanka. How is it going to affect this resplendent island in the long run when it comes to our exports?
Well, Britain, at the end of the day, is highly regarded both in India and in Sri Lanka and in China. And that's one of the selling points the Brexit advocates were making. They were saying, why are we close to Europe? You know, and English graduates in England are competing with European graduates for jobs here, and the European graduates speak 5 European languages. Britain's historic links have been with its Commonwealth and with the US, and it can develop those. So instead of having unskilled labour coming from Romania and Poland and Hungary, why doesn't Britain clamp immigration but allow more skilled labour to come from India, from Sri Lanka and so on? So Britain, in that sense, would be, in theory at least, be able to take on more immigrants from Sri Lanka who are qualified, doctors, engineers, IT specialists. So,
Just in one hand, you say it's going to affect Britain in the long run. However, now you are saying that it may help countries like Sri Lanka to exploit opportunities, employment opportunities in Europe and even Britain for that matter. How is it going to really affect? Is it a negative aspect or is it something positive for countries like Sri Lanka?
With everything, there's both a positive side and a negative side. What Sri Lanka has got to appreciate is that if, and this is a big if Britain does leave the EU, and again, if Britain replaces the current immigration rules allowing free movement of labour from the EU with an Australian-style points system allowing skilled labour from the rest of the world, including Sri Lanka and India, then Sri Lanka would be better off, or Sri Lankan emigration would be better off. But you get a much bigger two-way or much bigger flow of Sri Lankans able to get trained in the UK, able to work in the UK and so on. Don't forget the London Stock Exchange bought Millennium IT. So Sri Lanka's got a lot of strengths that people in the UK probably don't appreciate. Now when I tell friends of mine in the City of London that the stock exchange's IT systems were developed in Sri Lanka and they were so good that the London Stock Exchange actually bought the Sri Lankan company, they're absolutely amazed.
What is your advice to the Sri Lankan government, Dr. Joseph, in terms of preparing ourselves for the next 2 years?
Well, it's not just the next 2 years, it's a bit longer than that. I think Sri Lanka should look at it in 3 ways. Personally, I think Sri Lanka has the opportunity to be the next Singapore or the next Malaysia of Asia, or it could end up being the next Zimbabwe. And there are 3 things that I think it needs to focus on. One, it needs to bring the Tamil diaspora on board in a positive manner. In other words, bring them on side to invest, to do a positive development of the country. Secondly, Sri Lanka's got to realize that it's an island off the coast of India and not an island off the coast of Australia. And its biggest opportunity is to recognize that fact, because what you're seeing in the global financial markets and also in the foreign policy is a huge swing towards India. One of the biggest foreign policy developments of the last 20 years has been the rapprochement of America, of the US, with India. Prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, India was a leader of the non-aligned movement, but it was seen as pro-Russia, pro-Russian. Now India is seen as firmly in the US camp, and so you have a link between the most populous democracy in the world with the most powerful. And so the US is looking to India to lead this part of the region, or this part of the world. Thirdly, Sri Lanka's got to figure out how can it create jobs for its educated workforce. Because Sri Lanka's got a high literacy rate, it's got a highly educated workforce. That's great, but if you can't create jobs for them, then that creates the tensions that we're seeing with the JVP uprisings, with the Tamil Tigers and so on. So to answer that question, what Sri Lanka has got to see is that how can it, over the next, not 2 years, over the next 20 years, solve those three issues and combine them? Sri Lanka could be an educational hub for the region. You could set up an Indian Institute of Technology in Sri Lanka. You could do a lot of different things.
Lord Joseph, following the end of the conflict in the year 2009, it's close to 7 years now following the end of the conflict in Sri Lanka. Did you see foreign direct investments taking a leap forward? Did you see the country's economy moving forward during the last 7 to 8 years?
Well, it definitely has in the form of tourism. You can just look at the price of five-star hotel rooms. Prior to the end of the conflict, you could get a five-star hotel room on a beach resort for $60 a night. Now they're $300. Clearly, the economy has boomed in certain sectors, but not everyone wants to be a waiter at a hotel. The fact is that Sri Lanka's got to create higher quality jobs besides tourism. It's got to create jobs in the areas of IT and so on, where you have the educated workforce is superb. You've got very intelligent people in Sri Lanka, clearly highly educated. And to be honest, people when they actually travel to India and then Sri Lanka are amazed at the difference. Colombo is a cross between an Indian city and Singapore. It's a vision of what an Indian city could look like if it didn't have the dirt, the squalor, the poverty, and so on. So Sri Lanka has the opportunity to become an entity like Hong Kong with regards to China.
Not just you say that Sri Lanka has an opportunity to become a country like Hong Kong. Do we have the right mix? Do we have the right thinking in place to get there?
No.
And why is that?
Because people in Sri Lanka see India as a threat, or they look down upon Indians. I was at a wedding a few years ago, and I was sitting next to someone who was Sri Lanka's ex-High Commissioner to one of the neighbouring countries, and he had never set foot in India. And I said, how can you possibly represent Sri Lanka if you've never set foot in India? He said, well, my wife goes there shopping, and so that is the reality of it, that there's a whole segment of society who are either frightened of India or look down upon India. And that applies to Tamils as well as Sinhalese, that India is looked down upon. Yet the future for Sri Lanka, whether it likes it or not, is that whether you're Tamil or Sinhalese, you're a flea on the back of the Indian elephant. If you bite the elephant in the right way, it will charge in the way you want. If you bite it in the wrong way, you get crushed, which is what happened to the tigers. So the question of Sri Lanka is going to be, how can it exploit the world's veering towards India, the excitement that people, investors have now towards the Indian markets?
Doctor, you said that Tamil diaspora need to invest in Sri Lanka, and the government has a responsibility to open the doors for the Tamil diaspora to come into Sri Lanka and invest. Following the change that we experienced last year on the 8th of January with a new president coming into play, and then on the 17th of August a new government coming into play, do you think the right kind of environment has been created now for the Tamil diaspora to come to Sri Lanka and invest?
No, I haven't seen any evidence of that. No one's telling me that. No one I know has ever got excited about it. I haven't seen any changes. Maybe there are, but I'm not an expert on Sri Lankan politics. But all I can say is, as a member of the diaspora and outside, I haven't seen any strong evidence of changes and so on. Yet there's a lot of goodwill towards the country, but it hasn't happened.
Now, Joseph, you are currently a permanent resident in London. You stay in Britain. You've been there for the last many years. I'm not going to judge your age by that, Doctor, but taking into account the current scenario, would you come to Sri Lanka and invest your money and live in the country?
Yes, absolutely. I love the country. We come twice a year on holiday.
Would you stay in Sri Lanka? That's my question.
Yes, I have no problems about that. I have young children as well as older children. Yeah, I would love to if the opportunities were there, but it's not clear that the opportunities are there that would make it an attractive
the future, in terms of the next few months, in terms of the foreseeable future, how do you see the country's economy heading? Where do you see Sri Lanka's economy really heading in the next few months, the next few years?
Well, I'm not an expert on Sri Lanka's economy, so it's very difficult for me to answer.
As an outsider, how?
But as an outsider, I could just look at the hotels and the tourism industry, and you can see that tourist numbers are zooming up, and they're going to go up even more so because people are frightened to go to Tunisia, they're frightened to go to Morocco, they're frightened to go to the whole Mediterranean, North African regions. They're even frightened to go to the south of France now. Sri Lanka, funnily enough, is now seen as one of the safest places to go on holiday in the world. So the opportunities over the next couple of years just in boosting the tourist industry are absolutely phenomenal. The question is, can it go beyond just the tourist industry? Because they're enclaves. People arrive in Colombo, they fly or they go by bus to some beach resort, and they don't really impact the rest of the population.
When you take into account the global economy, Dr. Joseph, where would you invest your money in?
Emerging markets.
And where are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about Asia. I run a little portfolio. It's post-Brexit. It's done well because it's been invested in Asia. China, India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, even Japan has been doing quite well. Asia's doing very well at the moment, and personally, I think it's still likely to do even more. If you look at India, for example, or China, the economies are just so vast and still developing at such a rapid rate. You know, China's 50% urbanized only. There's 1 billion people in China. There's another 200 million people who, over the next 5 years or 10 years, will be moving from the countryside to the cities. So there's 200 million people who need flats, who need homes, who need cars, as their living standards rise. In India, that hasn't even been reached yet. You just look at the infrastructure requirements of India. They're phenomenal. They're 30 years behind China.
Now, just in terms of the future, you said that you advise fund managers, you advise financial experts. How best would you advise them in a post-Brexit environment? Where would you tell them to put their money? Where would you tell them to capitalize on? How do you see the future growth of the world economy?
Well, I think emerging markets are now coming out of a post-crisis slump. The opportunities is very much going to be in emerging markets. The developed markets are much more highly indebted. The debt ratios in the developed markets are much, much higher than emerging markets in general. And yet people's perceptions of risk in emerging markets is completely misguided. And as a result, the opportunities are very much so in the emerging markets. I mean, you may find a lot of pension funds whose allocations to emerging markets are ridiculously low.
Dr. Joseph, in terms of financial institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, do you think that these organizations have a genuine interest to salvage the countries that they assist?
Well, I can't really speak for what motivates them. I think they are becoming less and less relevant to economies, to developing markets, frankly, because as the private sector becomes more important, it has less need for a catalyst in the form of the World Bank and so on. I've actually set up equity funds in China that had investment from some of these institutions who acted as catalysts. But that was 15 years ago. Now they're no longer needed in China, really. And for example, the Commonwealth Development Corporation doesn't invest in Sri Lanka because it's seen as too well developed. Its per capita income is too high. And so that's what's gradually happening, that as the private markets in emerging markets, particularly Sri Lanka, which is already the case, get developed, they have less need for the World Banks of the world.
Where must Sri Lanka look at in the future for business opportunities? The West is quite problematic with Sri Lanka's human rights record, so on and so forth. Where must Sri Lanka really look at exports? Is it India? Is it China? Where must we really focus our attention?
I think India is. Sri Lanka shouldn't ignore the West. Frankly, it's always going to try and get its best ideas from the West. It's going to train its workforce in the West. Exports will always continue to the West. The point, however, is that Sri Lanka lies off the coast of India. The West is putting huge amounts of direct investment into India. What role can Sri Lanka play in those capital flows? Could Sri Lanka act as an offshore financial centre for India rather than Mauritius? I sat on the boards of a number of funds for India and China which were based in Mauritius. But why weren't they based in Sri Lanka? It seems quite bizarre to have an offshore centre for India thousands of miles away.
But transparency is important, Dr. Joseph, when the country is moving forward, when the country is looking at opening its markets. Offshore accounts not necessarily mean that the country's financial markets are transparent, isn't it?
Yes, no, absolutely. There's got to be, Sri Lanka's got to actually move much more towards a Singaporean style of transparency or set of ethics. I mean, ultimately, people want to do business in Sri Lanka because they see it as a safe place to do business with. It's got to be, there's got to be a strong corporate governance. At the end of the day, both the business sector and the politicians have got to actually realise Sri Lanka's got a great future. You can destroy it, as it's been destroyed time and time again post-independence by short-sighted politicians. The opportunity now, for example, just imagine Sri Lankan ports could be taking huge amounts of cargo from China, offloaded on Sri Lankan ports, divided into smaller ships and sent to Indian ports. So there's all sorts of activities where Sri Lanka could be acting as a service centre for this huge mega market just next to it.
How important is economic good governance, Dr. Joseph?
Well, clearly it's essential. Clearly it's essential. Not only economic, but also political governance. As I said, you compare what Zimbabwe could have been with what it is now. It was such a prosperous nation, yet mismanagement has created the mess it's in now. Sri Lanka could be the next Singapore, the next Malaysia, or the next Hong Kong.
Or even Zimbabwe for that
matter. Or the
matter.
next Zimbabwe, depending on purely on those factors. Economic governance and political governance.
Dr. Joseph, how important is policy stability when it comes to the country's economy?
I think policy stability is important for any country. And you look at what's happened to Britain now, where the policy changed overnight and sterling fell 20%. For investment to take place, there needs to be some idea that the rules that are in place today will still be in place in 5 years' time. What no investor can actually cope with is the idea that the rules today may actually change next week. They won't invest.
Dr. Joseph, 2008 there was a global financial crisis. You said that 2016 we've still not been able to come out of it. Are we going to expect another financial meltdown in the next few years or so? That is something that a financial expert like you can predict.
Well, I don't think anyone can predict it. Unfortunately, no one predicted the last crisis. I think there is certainly a significant chance we could see another meltdown. Absolutely. And I think
So you are not bullish about the world economy at present?
well, I think there are dangers in the world economy at present, and I think the problem is when you have a purely monetary response, in other words, printing of money and changing of interest rates only to alleviate essentially a depression, it hasn't changed the fundamentals. You know, the average wages in real terms in the US for most of the population hasn't changed for 15, 20 years. What you're seeing, the most dangerous part that we're seeing in both Europe and the West is the rise of populist politicians who are effectively winning votes on the back of this discontent with what's happened. The elites of the world in the West, in Europe, in the UK, in the US, have done very well post the crisis. Now, when interest rates went really low, asset values shot up. So anyone who owned capital, anyone who owned a house or shares or whatever, did really well. But the majority of the population didn't own that, and they've done badly. And so you have Donald Trump coming along and saying, vote for me and I'll make America great again. You had Boris Johnson saying the same in the UK. You had politicians, now you're having politicians in the Netherlands and Germany saying those things. Where the world faces a frightening danger that we will see the election of extreme populist politicians, as Sri Lanka has seen in the past. But you may end up seeing that. What will happen if Trump becomes president? No one's really too sure, but I think people are pretty nervous.
The US presidential election, which is going to happen in a few months, how is it going to affect the economy of the US, Britain, and even the world, for that matter?
Well, it depends on who actually gets elected. If you look at Trump, both Trump and Clinton have expressed views that they would like to roll back some of the moves towards globalization and global free trade, which, to my mind, is folly. Trump is a more extreme version of that. If Trump gets into trade wars with China, if he gets into setting up tariff barriers for imports to the US, it will cause a reduction in global trade. There's no doubt about that. And that's exactly what happened in the 1930s. You had tariff wars.
Where are you putting your money, Dr. Joseph?
Emerging markets.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joseph, for joining us this evening. It was a pleasure having you on board today.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it.